In 1951, a researcher put a man alone in a room for 48 hours. No tasks, no stimulation, no other people, just a bed, food, and silence. By hour 20, the man had started to hallucinate. By hour 36, he was experiencing what the researchers described as a complete breakdown of organized thinking. He had not been deprived of food or sleep. He had not been physically harmed in any way. The only thing that had been taken from him was other people. And that was enough to begin dismantling his mind. We talk about loneliness like it is an emotion, a mood, something that arrives when life gets quiet and leaves when it gets busy again. But that description misses almost everything important about what loneliness actually is. Loneliness is not a feeling your brain produces because you are sad. It is a biological alarm system, one that evolution spent millions of years building specifically because for most of human history, being separated from other people did not mean you were alone. It meant you were about to die. Your nervous system does not know the difference between social isolation and physical danger. It processes both the same way. When you are lonely, genuinely, chronically lonely, your body activates the same threat response it would use if a predator were nearby. Cortisol floods your bloodstream, inflammation markers rise, your immune system shifts from long-term protection to short-term emergency response. Your brain begins scanning every social interaction for potential threat, misreading neutral faces as hostile, interpreting ambiguous situations as rejection. The body goes to war against a danger it cannot locate, and the longer the isolation continues, the more the system stays switched on. John Cacioppo spent 3 decades at the University of Chicago studying what loneliness does to the human body. His findings were not what most researchers expected. He found that chronically lonely people had significantly higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol than socially connected people, even when no stressful event was happening. Their bodies were running a low-level emergency response continuously, around the clock, simply because the brain had concluded that the social environment was unsafe. He found that lonely people woke more often during the night, experienced less restorative sleep, and had immune systems that were measurably less effective at fighting off infection. He found that chronic loneliness raised the risk of early death by roughly 26%. That number sits above obesity. It sits above physical inactivity. Loneliness, by the data, is one of the most dangerous conditions a human body can be in. The mechanism Cacioppo identified is one of the most counterintuitive findings in modern psychology. He called it hypervigilance to social threat. When the brain decides that the social environment is dangerous, it does not simply make you feel bad. It rewires how you process the world around you. Lonely people are faster at detecting angry faces in a crowd. They are more likely to interpret a neutral comment as criticism. They are more likely to expect rejection from a new social situation before it has even begun. And here's the trap that makes chronic loneliness so hard to escape. The very state that makes you need social connection the most is the same state that makes every attempt at connection feel more threatening, more likely to fail, more painful before it has even started. The alarm that is supposed to drive you back toward people quietly begins to push you away from them instead. This is not a character flaw. It is a calibration error. The system was designed for a world where social isolation was brief, a few days alone in the forest, dangerous and uncomfortable, before you found your way back to the group. The alarm was supposed to be temporary, a prompt, not a permanent state. But in a modern world where millions of people live alone, work alone, move to new cities, and start again from nothing, the alarm can stay on for months, for years, and the longer it runs, the deeper the calibration error becomes. The brain that spent 6 months in social isolation does not simply recover the moment a person walks into a room full of people. It arrives suspicious, it arrives defended, it interprets friendliness as a potential threat before it interprets it as warmth. What makes the loneliness research genuinely difficult to read is the scale of it. In 2018, a survey in the United Kingdom found that more than 9 million adults, nearly a fifth of the entire population, reported feeling lonely, often, or always. The same year, the UK appointed a Minister for Loneliness, the first government in the world to formally treat social isolation as a public health crisis on par with other major diseases. In the United States, studies conducted before the COVID-19 pandemic found that roughly 40% of adults reported feeling lonely regularly. After the pandemic, that number rose significantly. We have built a world of extraordinary connectivity, more ways to reach each other than any humans have ever had, and produced one of the loneliest populations in recorded history. The research also dismantles one of the most common assumptions people make about loneliness. The assumption is that it is about quantity, that if you simply add more people to a lonely person's life, the loneliness resolves. Cacioppo's data showed this was wrong. What predicted loneliness was not the number of social interactions a person had. It was the quality. People surrounded by dozens of acquaintances reported the same physiological stress markers as people who saw almost no one. Because loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of feeling known by them. You can be in a crowded room and be completely alone. You can have hundreds of contacts in your phone and feel that none of them would notice if you disappeared. The brain is not counting bodies. It is measuring something much harder to manufacture. Cacioppo spent the last years of his career not describing the problem, but trying to solve it. His conclusion was not that we needed to be around more people. It was that we needed to practice being known. Small, repeated acts of genuine disclosure. The willingness to be seen before you are sure it is safe. Not the performance of connection, the scheduled calls, the social media posts, the professional networking, but the riskier, quieter thing underneath all of that. Letting someone know what is actually happening inside you and staying in the room long enough to see what they do with it. Loneliness is the alarm. Connection is not the silence of the alarm. It is the thing the alarm was trying to point you toward all along. The question is not whether you feel it. Almost everyone does, at some point, in some version. The question is whether you treat it as a verdict on your worth or as a signal from a system that is still, after all this time, trying to keep you alive.